Because the principle underlying all of epistemology up to her has been that knowledge is possible only if consciousness has no identity. Only if consciousness is a void, a nothing, devoid of character. The earliest, I'm not going to give you a whole history of philosophy, but a mini. The earliest here were the sophists in ancient Greece. And they applied it only to the sensory level. You know the standard sophist argument, when two men put their hands in lukewarm water, and one guy's hand is cold, so he says how warm, and the other guy's hand is hot, so he says how cool. And they shrug and say, you see, the nature of their senses influences the way they perceive, therefore no one perceives reality, etc. Therefore, they say, we have to perceive by our senses, therefore we have to perceive somehow, therefore no good. It's not the way things really are. Now at that point, Plato and the rationalists came in. And they said, okay, the senses are no good, but thankfully we have a faculty that's independent of the senses, namely reason, which operates by innate ideas. And therefore, reason can give us knowledge of reality, even if we can't rely on the senses. And that gave you a millennia or more of rationalism. But at least they tried to retain the idea we can live in reality, we can know reality, there are absolutes, there is truth, because they had the faculty of reason to hold on to. Now what finally ended this, the decisive historical turning point, was Kant. And all he really did is say he had one clever idea. He was the first ever to take the thought, what the sophists said about the senses is just as applicable to reason, or the mind, which was absolutely true, absolutely unanswerable, and utterly devastating. Kant said, in effect, now he took, thousands of unintelligible pages to say it, but reduced to its essence from our point of view, he said, look, in the exact same way that what we perceive depends on our senses, what we think depends on our mind. If we had a different kind of mind, if it functioned differently, if it didn't, for instance, use concepts, or it didn't form them the way it did, or whatever, all of our knowledge would be radically altered. All of our conceptual, intellectual, rational knowledge. And this is sometimes called the logicocentric predicament. You know what that is? The predicament is we can't use any logic but human logic. And whenever we try to say something is logical, it's because it's logical to our human minds. But if we wanted to know whether it's really logical, we'd have to see whether it was logical in itself apart from our minds. But how can we do that? We can't get out of our minds. We're trapped. Therefore, the best proof is no proof. The best argument is just for us. We can't get out of our minds, exactly in the same method that the sophists said we can't get out of the senses. And when Kant did that, that was the end of rationalism. Therefore, there was nothing left. He finally drew the principle that if consciousness is something, it's invalid. It can't know reality. And he drew the conclusion, therefore, down with reality. Now, he didn't say it. He said it was still there, but we couldn't know it. But that's a different question. But what it amounted to was he got rid of reality once and for all by simply applying to concepts what the sophists had done to the senses. And it was self-evident once he said it, that it had to be true. Now, ever since Kant, of course, the goal of philosophy has been how to function without reference to reality. Hegel said the only way would be to make one up ourselves. That's idealism. Subjectivism, and so on. Dewey said, let's not bother about it and just concern ourselves with what works, however we would know that. So it's been disaster ever since, but you see the whole thing hinged, the entire history hinged on this principle of consciousness possessing identity being an obstacle to cognition. If I had to single out any one principle, that is what has destroyed the whole of epistemology, and with it the whole of philosophy. Now, unfortunately, on this particular point, Aristotle offers no answer at all. On many points he does, but on this one he doesn't. Because he too held, at least judging from the fragments we have. And if the mind is something, that would interfere with its objectivity. And so he stresses that the mind is nothing. As in his terminology, it's nothing actual. It's merely the potential of becoming its object. The best he could struggle to do to make sense of validity was to say, when you perceive something, in his terminology, when you perceive a certain form, that form becomes actualized in your mind. So the identical redness is out there and in your eyeball. The identical abstraction is out there in the object, in tableness, and in here in your mind as tablehood. And he called the mind the place of forms. It's a bare place. It's nothing. And he felt if you gave it some character, any character, then you would have to be reduced to conscious. He didn't use that word con, of course, but that was the idea. Now, of course, this is hopeless. Everybody jumped down his throat to say, how can a nothing actual, perceive, think, etc.? It can't be done. So the mind has to be something. And the problem was, of course, that I'm sure that if Aristotle had the concept of consciousness, since he also had the concept of identity, he wouldn't have had a problem. But as I pointed out yesterday, the Greeks did not have that concept. Unfortunately, by the time the concept was formed with Augustine, philosophy had already turned mystical. So they had given away the senses, the body. They had turned against everything that would give consciousness a nature. And consequently, they couldn't do anything with the concept. They had thrown out the law of identity. The first time in the history of thought that we have the concept of consciousness united with a militant, formal, explicit acceptance of the law of identity is with Ayn Rand. And that is her crucial role in the history of epistemology. That is what is the importance of consciousness as possessing identity. And that's why I expect her theory in time, I don't know whether in our lifetime, to revolutionize the history of the subject. Because this is really a climactic turning point. Now, of course, she couldn't have done it without her theory of concepts and all the other things that led her to grasp this principle. But nevertheless, this principle in itself has the status that's, on the one hand, it's self-evident. Of course, consciousness is something. No, who could deny it? And yet, on the other hand, who could deny it? Everybody in history has denied it, has emphatically denied it. And if you see that here is a case where the self-evident is unknown, unconceived by the totality of professionals in the field. Now, I want to say one more word about the